The aim of this research project, and it is an ongoing project, we are still working hard on it. We're even rarer Repton in Hampshire than Wales, because we've only got 2 accredited sites, of which this is one, Herriard Park in Hampshire. In the absence of a red book, there was one, but there isn't now. What this project is aiming to do is to reconstruct the work carried out by George Purfoy Jervos, which is a mouthful, but is still known by the family at Herriard as GPJ, which is how I shall refer to him for brevity's sake. The work carried out by him to plans drawn up by Repton for a new walled kitchen garden, pleasure grounds and plantations. GPJ was the eldest son of a vicar, but in 1792, at the tender age of 22, he inherited Herriard from an uncle, and immediately he set about establishing his standing and his status in the society into which he had moved. He'd made quite a big jump up in terms of social standing. Almost all of our material for this research project comes from an extraordinarily rich family archive, which is in the Hampshire Record Office, and that was part of him establishing his status. He kept all his documents, all his letters, and so on, and they ended up, thankfully, in Hampshire Record Office. We know there's lots of documents that prove that Repton was there. This is his receipt for payment for work done eventually at Herriard. Received of GPJ Esquire £35, 14 shillings, which together with the 10 guineas before received is in full for business done at Herriard's. And it's dated 1795, which is 3 years after he actually produced the work, as usual. Bill was paid late. So Herriard's in the middle there. Basingstoke to the north, Winchester, Southampton to the south and the southwest. Originally part of a much larger, huge estate which belonged to the Paulet family of Hampshire and which stretched from Old Basing, just to the east of the town of Basing, Old Basing, Hackwood Park, which was a huge park here, and Herriard as well. But Herriard came into the Gervais family through marriage in 1601, and they are still there. The house that Repton would have known is this one, built in 1704, probably to the designs of John James, and it stood until 1959, when Herriard was inherited by a Canadian branch of the family who were willing to come and take on the estate, but didn't want the house because it was no longer fit for purpose. So the planners allowed them to demolish it and on the same site build a 1950s house, which is still there. But in the record office, among other things, is this drawing of the front elevation of that house. The plan is undated, unsigned, but you can see on the garden front of the house to the north, 2 sort of formal ponds, rectangles with bays in them, and those are part of a garden design done by George London. So this was the garden that was there before Repton arrived. George London's designs, which are also in the record office in Winchester, are dated 1699. There is none of the George London garden left. It was completely swept away, with one partial exception, which I will come back to at the end of this talk. So we know that Repton was there because we have his bill, and at the bottom is the receipt that I've already shown you. So he was there in June 1793. So he's not been that long launched on his career, but he's making his way. Cost of his first visit, 2 days, 10 guineas, standard fee that he charged. Red book of plans, etc., £21. He visited again in December of the same year and produced working plan instructions for the kitchen garden and plantations, 1 guinea, bringing the total that he wrote the receipt for a few years later. Attached to the top of this bill is another slip of paper, which has all the hallmarks of the client saying to Repton, well, what are your terms then? And it got scribbled down on a piece of paper. And that slip reads, 5 guineas per day of expenses for post horses, not more than 120 miles return. Red book from 15 to 30 guineas according to size. So the Herriard Red Book was in sort of the middle range of pricing, I think. But it is lost. The Red Book has been lost a long time. We know that it was done because Repton dispatched it by coach to Basingstoke on the 27th of September, 1793, and he wrote to his client saying, I have previously lost such a parcel by the carelessness of the coachman. So, and then went on to say, please let me know when it arrives safely. We assume it did. In this archive, there's a sequence of 18 letters from Repton to his client, to JPJ, dated from 1793 to 1801, which was the last letter. In themselves, they are very interesting in throwing another light into how Repton communicated with his clients, but also really underlines that the man was never in one place for very long. These letters are full of saying, I will be passing by, or if I make a forced march, I can get to Hampshire in 3 days. He was always on the road going somewhere and passing through Hampshire as he went. But after the December visit in 1793, the relationship really seems to have stagnated and stalled. The correspondence starts to look very one-sided. Repton's letters increasingly are saying, well, I'll be in the neighbourhood, would you like me to call? I'm at your service. Until in 1799, he writes, it is now very long since I had the honour of hearing from you. I hope the kitchen garden and plantations are made and all going on propitiously. Be so good as to say what progress you have made. So I think here at Herriard we have an example of the client taking Repton's, the Red Book and the plans, and then that was it. No, don't need you anymore. We'll do it ourselves, which is what JPJ proceeded to do, because from the moment he inherited Herriard, and he had Repton in less than a year after he inherited Herriard, he was spending huge amounts of money, both on improving the house and also on laying out the grounds. The kitchen garden was built and is still standing. And this is the earliest estate map we have that show it. So this is the estate plan of 1818 with some alterations which were done in 1799. And we'll come back to this plan later. But the kitchen garden here, the octagonal walled kitchen garden, was built. The first brick was laid in 1796. As you can see from this aerial, it is still standing. The walls are intact still. Its usage now is, a large part of it is, as you can see, riding stables and a menage. Interestingly, the northeast wall, the buildings are new on the northeast wall, but they have been put on the same footprint as the original. So they reflect that design. And the wall, which marks the stables from the garden, we know that it's the original because that wall has under it those semicircular tunnels that allowed the fruit tree roots to grow both sides of the wall. It was a way to improve the growth of espaliered trees. We had Susan Campbell come and look at it with us, so we know that. We have, in this archive, we have all of the costs for all of the work that went on at Herriard. So here we have an early estimate of the costs. So we have all the costs for bricks bought, where they were brought from, where they were made, quantities, carriage of all materials needed. And this early estimate, which gives a cost of 587 odd pounds, in fact, in the end, cost JPJ just slightly over £1,000 to build the kitchen garden, which, depending on which converter you use, makes it about sort of £95,000 in today's money. So he was spending an awful lot of money. We know that John Freeborn of Herriard cleaned 200,000 old bricks for the foundations, which must have been a hell of a job, because an older kitchen garden was demolished and the bricks from that were used in the foundations of the new garden. So over the period sort of 73 to about the end of the century, during that period, JPJ was, we believe, implementing a large part of what must have been the Red Book plans, certainly the instructions for the kitchen garden and plantations. And in the archive, there are complete lists of all the trees, shrubs, flowering plants, fruit trees, fruit bushes, vegetable seeds, everything that was bought for this garden. When we finished doing the transcript in the record office, the transcript covers 50 pages. So there's a lot of material. You know those long, thin strips that gardeners used to use to write down their orders, or they were all rolled up in little cigarette bundles in the record office. So the following few slides are just going to give you a flavour of what we've found in this archive. So tree planting, and this pattern continues through all sorts of planting going on at Herriard at this period. 1976 is the peak period of planting of all kinds. So we have here, blue is the deciduous trees, mostly for the park, but also the pleasure grounds as well. Lots of evergreens, very popular. And then a layer of ornamental trees, specimen trees, which were very specifically identified and ordered for the pleasure grounds. There are a lot, this is, one of the survivor trees in the park. There are a few still in the parkland at Herriard, but also signals of Repton. You start to think about what Repton wrote. The other photograph of trees, Repton wrote, no groups of trees will appear natural unless two or more trees are planted very near each other. He was bemoaning the habit of gardeners of putting trees in equally spaced rows. To produce this effect, two or more trees should sometimes be planted in the same hole. Well, this is what's happened there. And we found three or four examples near the house in the pleasure grounds of multiple trees having been planted together in the same place. So shrubs and ornamental trees, do not attempt to read that list, but it's just there to give you an idea of the huge range and variety of things that were being specifically named and ordered for the gardens. That's just one order in the winter of 1796. It gave us some identification problems. We still don't know. You see the one that's underlined, which says 2 great Theopluasti. Anybody know what they are? Tell me afterwards. But also, always in the orders, there are these specific things that are being ordered by him. And then at the bottom, 2,000 quicksets, so clearly a lot of hedge laying was going on in the parkland. 197 evergreen and flowering shrubs, which is an odd number. Why not 200? And that recurs throughout the archive. Obviously, they're just saying to the nurseryman, give us 200 evergreen and flowering shrubs. Just, whatever you've got, the sort of thing we like. And lots of Portuguese laurels, always sort of specifically requested. They were twice the price of ordinary laurels, but they were very popular at this time. So a mix of evergreen, unspecified evergreen and flowering shrubs, but then very specifically named things that were wanted. The nurseryman supplying all of this was a man called John Armstrong of North Warnborough, which is about 6 miles from Herriard. He had a reasonably sized nursery, but nowhere near capable of delivering all of this. So we are certain, although we haven't followed that trail as far as we can, that he must have been buying in stuff, probably from the West London nurseries at that time, particularly the more unusual and exotic trees and shrubs that were being ordered, because JPJ was obviously interested in planting. There are some very specific and unusual and expensive shrubs and trees, particularly from the eastern and southeastern coasts of America, and later on in the century, the new plants that were coming in from the Cape. He wanted those too. Fruit. Lots and lots and lots of fruit ordered for the kitchen garden. We puzzled briefly about why so many dwarf fruit trees were being ordered. These would have been grafted, it's what the French had been doing for about 100 years, grafting onto dwarf fruit stocks. Certainly the greenhouse in the kitchen garden wouldn't have been large enough to accommodate these quantities of dwarf fruit trees. But clearly a dwarf fruit tree is easier to protect in bad weather, easier to force for early fruit. And for Hampshire, Herriard is actually quite high up and slightly exposed, so we think that's probably why dwarf fruit trees did better there. The photograph at the bottom is also a walled garden in Hampshire, a very old and beautiful line of espaliered apple trees. And we also have, which is very interesting in the archive, planting lists for specific locations. And this takes us straight back to Repton, I think. Plants for, to do what Repton wrote that you should be doing, to shelter and screen the barns, stables, kitchen garden, offices, and other useful but unpleasing objects. I propose to conduct walks through shrubberies, plantations, and small sequestered lawns. And that's exactly what has been done here. I've marked on the map all of the locations for which we have specific planting lists. From this terrace here, which is 310 meters long, massive long terrace on the garden front of the house. The offices here, this was the drying yard. Up here, close to the kitchen garden, of course, farmyard and buildings, coach house, timber yard. And inside here, melon ground, hothouse, greenhouse, flower garden, again, a very Repton thing, a flower garden inside the kitchen garden with an entrance to it, so that the ladies of the house could walk into the flower garden and to admire it. Now, these planting lists are, again, very specific about what is required, and it's a rich mix of ornamental flowering and scented shrubs, roses, flowers set off by evergreens in a frame of evergreens. The planting here for the terrace, it's got very specifically front row, back row of the terrace, 300 plus meters long terrace, puzzled us because it's a hodgepodge. There's no sense of sort of gradation from the back to the front of the terrace. But we're now reviewing this against what Mark Laird calls the distinction of conspicuousness. In other words, if you've got a tree or a shrub which is rare or expensive, you particularly want your visitors to admire, things like that would determine where you put it on the terrace and in the border. The rest of the planting list, again, very specific, round the walls of the stable, the wood yard, the border on the left hand, we don't know where that was, by the front door, absolutely classic Repton, 30 laurels, large, 5 laurustinus, 10 philarias. At Langley Park in Kent, Repton wrote that the front of the house should be framed by 2 masses of evergreens. Well, there they are. So there are lots of echoes in the archive that take us back to what Repton was writing about. In all his books, Repton mentions Herriard once, and that's in a footnote. And it's where he writes about breaking an avenue, how to break an avenue to create side views out of it. And in this footnote about Herriard, he says, "An avenue of firs is the most obstinate to break. Therefore, in the stupendous double row of large silver firs, which the false taste of the last century has planted at Herriard's house, I have advised the destruction of one half, leaving the other as a magnificent specimen of the ancient style of gardening." Well, the avenue's still there. It's difficult. We have some references in the archive from his steward to JPJ saying the workmen are felling firs in different locations around the park and in the avenue. So clearly some clearance was done of this double yellow. But here it is in 1791, before Repton arrived. And here it is again in first series 1801. And it's still there. So we're not clear how much was taken down. That the open space between the house and the avenue is where George London's garden would have been laid out. So I think this avenue is actually the only remaining feature from that formal garden that George London had laid out for the house, taking the vista out into the countryside. And it is still there. Planted, has been replanted, I think, a couple of times, now planted with deciduous trees, but on the same footprint, almost in the same planting holes as the original. So this view is from about a third of the way up it, looking back down across the open space to the new house at the bottom of the vista. Repton's last letter to JPJ, it was in 1801, in which his last gasp attempt to re-engage with his client. "I am unwilling to be so near Herriard without giving you notice of it, that I may have the pleasure of paying my respects to you, if I can be of any use to finish the plans for improvement begun under my direction." And that was it. That was the end of the correspondence. We know that Repton was in Hampshire in 1801 because he was at Stratton Park, about 10 miles away, the other Repton site in Hampshire, home of Sir Francis Baring, for which he did produce a red book. So there's another story under all this for another time, but just briefly, JPJ married in 1798, but by 1799 he was massively in debt. He was in real straits. Numerous letters to his father and from his father with, stern, reverend advice on what he should do. But he was still spending. In 1799, he spent a lot of money on plants from the Cape, ericas particularly, which he seemed to be very keen on. So he was still spending like there was no tomorrow, but he had no money to pay his debtors. In one letter, he writes to his father, "I may have to flee to France to escape my debtors." We think, well, 1799, that might probably have been a very good idea. At the same time, he was a captain in the Hampshire regiment, so he was often not at Herriard. They were on manoeuvres all the way up and down the Hampshire coast, waiting for what they call in letters the men without breeches to come across the channel. So he was out and about on manoeuvres with the regiment, spending huge amounts of money and going bankrupt, and that's another story. But what he had done by 1799 was actually to have created a very high-status house and garden that he wanted. Thank you.